Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I am your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed trauma recovery and lifestyle design coach. I have today with us Rita Bliven. Rita has written Canyons and Fireworks, which details her lifelong journey of healing from a debilitating avoidant attachment style due to an international parental kidnapping. From this place of healing and love, she's been able to enjoy an abundant life. In Canyons and Fireworks, she's honest about the cause, confusion, the victories, setbacks, and the full process of healing. Rita's hope is that by sharing her stories, others will identify and tear down the walls that block love so that true intimacy, identity, and purpose can truly flourish. The book is set to release later this year. Rita, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited. Before we dive into a little bit more about your story, since we're going to talk so much about avoidant attachment, can you just tell us a little bit more about attachment theory and what the attachment styles are?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I know it's so much work for you podcasters and it doesn't go unappreciated on my end. So thank you so much.
Thanks for saying that.
But to answer your question, attachment theory is kind of pretty basic and really common knowledge when you think about it for a lot of mamas and grandmas and aunts that raise children. And the idea is that in order for a child to have the ability to fully develop later in life, they need to have at least one strong bond with at least one primary caregiver. And the caregiver needs to be loving, responsive, and consistent.
Yes.
And so in a sense, that's kind of common sense. The caregiver does not need to be a biological relative, but they need to be loving, responsive, and consistent. And a lot of children that suffer abuse or neglect never form that strong bond and have difficulty later on in life.
Yeah.
The one that is less understood is if there are extreme separations. So you could have a child that's raised by their mother, and then their mother gets cancer and dies, and then another caregiver comes in and takes over. And even though everybody's loving and responsive, because that's not consistent, it can create a problem. So that was my issue, is that I was separated from everyone I bonded with in my early life. And I think the other question that you asked are just what are the different attachment styles? Was that the other portion that you wanted me to cover?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, there's secure or healthy attachment, and then there's insecure or unhealthy attachment. Within the unhealthy side, there are three styles that are unhealthy. And everybody tilts a little bit one way or the other. But when you get into the unhealthy attachment, it's extreme. So there's avoidant, anxious, and disorganized. Avoidant is what I was, and that is somebody has a fear of intimacy or fears that they're going to be lost in a relationship, they're going to lose themselves, and they can't trust others, and they really can't trust themselves in relationships. And so they avoid intimate relationships. The anxious is afraid of being alone. And I say all the, kind of love addicted. He's constantly trying to get those feelings of love filled, and they're going to run toward relationships. Even if the relationship is unhealthy and not good for them, they're so desperate to have relationship that sometimes they make poor choices in relationships. And then disorganized is a combination of the two, and it's the most rare, and there's a higher probability of having disorganized attachment if there was alcoholism in your upbringing with your primary caregivers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Thank you for explaining all of that. So the idea behind attachment theory is this: how you attach to your primary caregivers or lack thereof, or if it's abusive or traumatic, literally affects not just your relationship with yourself, but your relationship with other people for the rest of your life until you do the healing work. And what's beautiful is you can actually regrow your attachment. It's kind of like the idea of reparenting yourself, right? So this is the first couple weeks, months first couple of years as you're growing, as the hippocampus is still developing, you're kind of becoming your own independent little person. It is super important that you have someone who is there for you. And so someone also might call this, the anxious might also be called ambivalent. You also have the avoidant as fearful and avoidant as dismissive, right? And so that's what we're going to kind of cover today is attachment. So with that being said, tell us a little bit about your story, this horrific trauma that you went through as a young girl.
Sure. So my dad was a Mexican immigrant, and my mom was a natural born citizen. And when they started their divorce, my father feared that he wouldn't have any custody rights against a citizen since he was only a legal resident at the time.
Yeah.
And so he took me, he fled to Mexico when I was a baby, and he kept me for about 2 years there. And I've had people ask me, well, is that just your dad taking you to his hometown? No, it's a kidnapping, and it's considered a parental kidnapping because he severed all ties with my mom and her side of the family. So it wasn't like I lived with my dad in Mexico and visited my mom, or I lived with my dad in Mexico and had phone calls with my mom. It was very much intended that I was going to never see my mother again. And I bonded with him and his side of the family, and they're very loving. I mean, what he did was out of love. It wasn't out of hate. He did it out of love to be with me. And my Mexican family is great, and I bonded with them. And then when I was 3 years old, my mom got me back and did the exact same thing. She was afraid that he would try to take me to Mexico again. So she severed all ties with his family and with him and changed my name so that he couldn't find me. And I moved across the country back to her hometown. And so I didn't see my father again or his side of the family until I was an adult. And so everyone that I bonded with in the beginning stages of my life when I was developing, I got separated from. And my earliest memories are of being in a new country surrounded by people that didn't look like me and people that didn't speak my language, because I learned Spanish while I was in Mexico as my first language.
Of course. Yeah. Wow, my goodness. Both parents just have so much love for you, but we're also operating in so much fear. So it's like
Yes.
that unhealed wounds that they have.
Yeah.
And that's often how trauma comes down, in developmental trauma with children. Our parents are maybe doing the best that they can. It's not always necessarily abusive, but the consequence is really the child when you're operating in so much fear. So how did this, as you got older and you got reconnected with your dad, was that connection able to be reestablished with him and his family? Yeah.
Yes. It wasn't until much later. It wasn't until my 20s. So I met my father when I was about 18 or 19, and it wasn't the best first meeting. But later on, we reconnected and truly bonded. And then I went to California because a lot of his family lives in California. And then I went to Mexico, and being in Mexico was like filling the biggest void that I had in my heart, and just really like going back home, which is so odd because I was 3 years old when I came back to the United States with my mother, and I don't have any conscious memory of being in Mexico because I was too little. But somehow your identity is formed during that time. And it really was like being home for the first time in my life.
Wow.
And that was the beginning of having a lot of breakthrough in my attachment healing journey.
Yeah. So how was this presenting for you, this avoidance that you had? How was it presenting with friends and relationships that you were in?
So I actually made friends very easily. It was a problem feeling love in my family, my mom's family. So I was growing up with my mom and her family, didn't have any contact with my dad. And my mom's family is a big, loving family. I mean, she's one of five. My grandparents had a 100-acre farm, so everybody built houses on the farm just about. And I had cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents all within a 1 mile radius. And I did feel love sometimes, but I felt alienated or disconnected from it a lot of times. And it made me feel guilty. So I had a lot of depression and anxiety because I consciously knew that I was extremely loved. And I felt it sometimes, but I didn't feel it all the time. And so as a child, I just internalized that as being my fault. I remember being a pretty depressed child in elementary school. And I remember in first grade being depressed. And that was really the main problem that I wanted remedied.
Yeah.
But I also folded very quickly on arguments. I also, I was always just trying to create a bond with people
Right.
and not really having a healthy example of that. And so I made lots of friends and I was, pretty popular, but I never felt like I belonged. And I never felt like I really belonged in my family. I didn't feel like I really belonged in my circle of friends at school. And, and then also I was half Mexican in Western Pennsylvania in the 90s. And so I was the only Mexican kid in my school. So that just sort of added to the alienation, excuse me. And so there were just several factors that I didn't have a sense of belonging. That's the main thing. And then there are ripple effects from there.
Sure.
Like I said, of depression and anxiety. And it was pretty early in life.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm curious, when you bring this up to your mom, would you ask about where your dad is? Did you get any kind of emotional support from her about what had happened?
So it was never a secret because, like I said, my first memories were of learning English,
Yeah.
and it was a hands-on process. And so it was always explained to me what had happened. There were no secrets whatsoever. And I grew up knowing everything, which makes it a little bit numb, probably is how I would describe it.
Yeah.
So, if you're an older kid and you find out, oh my goodness, I'm adopted, it's just a flood of emotions. I never had that because it was always known to me.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit numb and it was kind of the status quo. And I knew it was affecting me, but at the same time, I thought it's not really affecting me. I think a lot of people that go through trauma and survive think that. They think, well, of course it's affecting me, but it's not really affecting me. But my mom got me in professional Christian counseling when I was 13 or 14 years old, which was pretty progressive in the 90s. Not many people were, counseling and mental health and all of that wasn't as mainstream as it is now. So that's really the best thing that my mom did. She also told me that my dad was the love of her life and that it was because he got into drugs and alcohol that they had to separate and she had to protect me from him. But that by the time I grew up, he would probably be set straight because his family was the best family in the whole world. And even if he wasn't straightened out when I was older, that his family was great and worth meeting, and that would be appropriate for me when I was older. And so I grew up with that hope that I would reconnect with my father, and if not my father, then his family. And my mom is not one to give empty compliments. So I believed her, very much so believed that someday I would meet my family and that they would be great. But then also, I think the best thing that did for me is that it let me know that I came from good people. And it wasn't like I had this deadbeat dad that was a loser and his family, wasn't the best family, and I just couldn't be in their lives. It was because of this unique situation and because your dad did get wrapped up with drugs and alcohol, I need to protect you from this right now, but later on, you will be able to reconnect. And now that I'm an adult, I realize I really needed that. And I hate when children are separated from one of their parents and there's no hope for reconciliation. I just think that's such a tragedy. And I know sometimes there isn't hope. So you don't want to give false hope, but I just can't imagine having that level of disappointment because a child separated from one of their parents already is dealing with a high level of disappointment, but to not have any hope for reconciliation, I just can't even imagine what that would be like.
And was that story fully true about the drugs and alcohol?
Yeah, so he came from a great, wonderful family, was a great guy. My mom fell in love with him. They fell in love with each other. They taught each other their languages. And my dad later became an English teacher in Mexico. My mom became a Spanish teacher in Pennsylvania. So it's funny. They taught each other their languages. But it was the early 80s and he got introduced to drugs and alcohol. And, he was 20, 21, 22. How many people, struggle with those things at that age? And he's now totally recovered and clean and has been for, I think, 20 years, 15 or 20 years, I think, and is wonderful now. But she was correct that it did get a little out of hand for him.
And so when he had you in Mexico, so he had you as a baby for more than 2 years, how was he taking care of you when he was struggling? Was it the rest of the family was taking care of you?
Yeah. So in Mexico, the women raise the children. So it was his mother, so my grandmother, and then his grandmother, which was my great grandmother, and three of his sisters. So he's one of 11. But at the time that I was there, there were three sisters that either were still living at home or living very close to home. And I used to call them my three moms. Apparently, I used to say I have three moms when I was a little kid. They took care of me. He saw me often, and he tells stories of drinking a beer or something, and me taking the beer and throwing it away at like 2 or 3 years old, or pointing to my fake watch and saying it's too late to be drinking. And so he was still drinking, but I still bonded with him. I mean, I still loved him.
Yeah. And the main caretakers being your three moms,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost kind of like two wrongs don't make a right, right? Your dad shouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
taken you, kidnapped you, and cut you off from your mom. But at the same point, she took you away from your three moms to bring you back, rightfully so, but
Mm-hmm.
really to
Rightfully
sever
so.
that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That may have been psychologically in your brain the actual hardest thing, not necessarily just for your dad, but if they were your main
Right.
caregivers and you had three of them,
Mm-hmm.
and now you are back in Pennsylvania with this woman that at that point you don't have any remembrance of.
Connection with, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really hard. So we know that intimacy in relationships has so much value. How is intimacy so possible when there's been so much abuse and neglect, especially in those formidable years?
So not to sound too corny and non-clinical, but I do think love is a powerful force. And so even when you're broken, as I was, love still seeps in a little bit. And and sometimes unhealthy love seeps in, which is very unfortunate because then it's the cycle continues and is generational. But a little bit of good love does seep in. And then if you're like me, you're able to get some professional help
Yeah.
and learn tools to identify what's more healthy and what's less healthy. And then you learn how to have the strength and courage to go after what's healthy, even if it's uncomfortable, and to let go of what's unhealthy, even if it feels like it's what you're more comfortable with. And as you love better and more, you begin to heal. So you
Mhm.
need love to heal from an attachment issue, but an attachment issue separates you from healthy love. So you have to break that barrier at least a little bit. And then once you start breaking that barrier, it becomes easier.
Yeah, the real healing, it sounds like for you, took place as you really started to reconnect with yourself, right?
Mhm.
Like you're connecting with yourself, but also your story. Like this happened to me.
Mhm.
Now what? Which is
Right.
really beautiful, right? The self-love, I think, has to be one of the most important things because then you can realize that you're worth finding healthy love and healthy relationships and romance and friendships.
Mhm.
So I think that's really beautiful. When did you really start feeling safe with people? At what point in your journey?
It's going to sound super depressing because it took a while. It wasn't until my early 30s.
Mm,
So in my teen years, I got a lot of knowledge
yeah.
through counseling. And I think that was very important, but I didn't really have the breakthroughs
Mm,
in counseling. And maybe that's just age, or maybe I don't know. Maybe there's tons of different factors, but I got a lot of knowledge.
mm,
And then in my early 20s, it was just trying to survive. I just went out into the world and, worked 2 jobs, 3 jobs sometimes at a time. And inner healing took a little bit of a back seat. And
mm,
I was also having fun,
yeah.
being someone in your early 20s and partying with your friends. And because I didn't have a healthy attachment, I wasn't choosing the best relationships and friends or romantically. And so I regressed a lot. That knowledge did not help me. And then also was not in a healthy state. And I became more unhealthy because of my unhealthy relationships.
Yeah.
And so, and then in my later 20s is when I really started to connect with my father. And
Yeah.
when I really went back to Mexico, when I went back to Mexico, even though it was very healing to meet my father and his family, it was when I went actually back to Mexico that just, like I said, I think I said earlier, a huge void was filled. And I think it's a little sad because not everybody can do that. But in my case, I was able to do that. And it just was like all of the knowledge that I had gotten in counseling started clicking.
Yeah.
And then I was able to start really using the tools and engaging. And then by my early 30s, I was also able to use the tools, not just with family, but with friends and romantic relationships. And it wasn't really until my early 30s that I felt like I was on the other side of this big attachment thing that I had been working on since I was a teenager. It took a while for me, but part of that is because I stopped engaging in the inner healing process. Or at other times I was just so overwhelmed by all of it. Or at other times the knowledge was an excuse to not grow. So, counseling can do that
Yeah.
where we say, well, I'm this way because of the trauma. And so that's why I'm this way and there's nothing I can do about it. I would have never said that out loud.
Right.
But back in the back of my mind, there was a little bit of a belief there until a little bit later.
Yeah, I think that's really common for trauma survivors of any type of trauma, especially if it's complex trauma, because the untangling is so much work and it's exhausting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times where you're like, you know what? I just can't anymore. I don't want
Yes.
to right now, and you're almost kind of making it, people who understand burnout, like in the corporate world, burnout when you're juggling kids and maybe you've gone back for your master's and you're working full time and you're struggling in your relationship and you just crash. That is very similar to what life is like, trying to juggle all of the things and do your
Yep,
trauma healing at the same time. It's exhausting.
it
And
is.
so to kind of take that break. So I think the opposite side of playing victim, where you go, well, I do this because of my trauma, and so leave me alone. The
Mm-hmm.
the other side could be, I know why I do this, and this is where I am right now, and I'm going to continue to get better,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's slow, even if I'm taking a pause right now. I just
Mm-hmm.
need a pause. I need a break. I need a breather, and you'll get there when you get there, kind of. I love
Mm-hmm.
that. I love that recognition. It's an important thing to name, that you wouldn't have said it out loud, but that is exactly what you were playing on. I think it's just really, really common for the survivors that are listening, going, "Oh my God, I feel the same way," because it's hard. It's really, really hard work. It's worth
It is
it,
hard work.
but it's really, really hard. So yeah, I
It
love
is.
that. I want to dive in to your book. Tell us a little bit about it. Why did you write this? Who is it for? Who should be reading it?
So, of course, I talk about attachment a lot. It's my memoir. It wasn't until COVID, when I was not so busy in the world. I was essential, so I never stopped working, but I just wasn't nearly as busy. And I had gotten married, and I always wanted to write a book. The first thing I ever wanted to be in life was a writer. So I always knew that someday I would write a book.
Yeah.
And it was years earlier on the plane ride home from Mexico, when I was exhausted and sleeping on the plane, that in and out of sleep, you know how when you're on a plane, you're kind of in and out of sleep.
Yeah.
I just realized what a great story the whole thing was, because I was just so filled up, when I went to Mexico. I mean, my love tank was so full. And I sort of knew, well, I've always wanted to write a book and this story needs to be told.
Yeah.
But that was probably about 10 years ago. And there were other steps. I wasn't on the other side of attachment healing
Yeah.
just from going to Mexico. That's when the breakthrough was so tremendous
Yeah.
that I knew I was going to get there, but
Yeah.
I was still in process for a few years. And so it was just something I put in the back of my mind. And then COVID slowed the world down, and I was thinking about, writing. And one of my best friends came to visit me, and she got me like 5 journals. And, she's a person of faith. I'm a person of faith. And she said, I don't even know if you like to write or if you want to write, but I just feel like you're supposed to start writing. And that was just the confirmation I needed, because I was already thinking about it and feeling like I needed to do it. And so it's my memoir, it's my journey. It's a non-clinical view of the attachment healing journey, which is funny because now that I've done more research, I really went through all of the recommended steps.
Yeah.
I didn't know it. I mean, yes, I was in counseling, and yes, I was somewhat guided by my counselor, but some of it was just divine intervention. I mean, when my dad reconnected with me, I really wasn't in a place to connect with him yet. But we ended up connecting, and that was, super healing, and just different things that happened weren't necessarily me going after it,
Yeah.
But I just think the combination of counseling and knowledge and wanting healing allowed me to engage in the different steps, even though I didn't necessarily orchestrate them all, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me that that healing is possible, and the love and life on the other side of it is so worth it. And I just want to help people as much as possible, because even though I was in counseling, there weren't a lot of resources when I was going through it.
Yeah.
Like I said, I mean, as everybody knows, the mental health industry has gotten a lot more attention in recent years, but I was like, you know, following a blind path. But if I can help anybody have a little bit more direction, I would just love to do that.
I love that. Yeah, of course, our last question is always about resources. You've named a lot though, because reconnecting with who you are, reconnecting with your heritage, with your past, going back to the place where you were essentially raised for those first few
Mhm.
attachment years. The counseling, of course, was helpful. You felt a lot of healing in your mom's story and the hope that she gave. I would say that's like an internal resource that helped you to be
Mhm.
resilient through that. Is there maybe one or two that we haven't caught on? It sounds like you had a good support system with your best friend and journaling, and I'm sure
Mhm.
writing also was a bit cathartic. So
Oh,
is there
yes.
anything else that was helpful for you as you were healing?
Yes, I have two major resources. Number one, Dr. John Townsend's Hiding from Love book.
Mm,
That is the book that truly showed me that I had the power to change. You know, it was overwhelming for me at the time and extremely emotional, but it's exactly what I needed. And I
mm,
recommend it for everybody. I think on some level, we all hide from love,
yeah.
even if we don't have an attachment disorder or extreme attachment style. So I think anyone could benefit from reading the book. And
Mm,
then the second major thing was meditation and
mm,
resetting my nervous system. And, you know, we say, oh, you need to know yourself. And there's nothing worse to tell an avoidant. You just need to open up and you just need to be
right.
yourself. And it's, well, what does that even mean? The avoidant doesn't even know what that means.
Yeah.
It's like telling a poor person, just be rich already. Stop
Right.
being poor. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But meditation gets you there. Meditation helps you know who you are and in tune with yourself. And you know, the avoidant avoids their own feelings
Yeah.
and stuffs their own feelings a lot. And the meditation helps you honor your own feelings and feel your own feelings.
Yeah.
And then you're able to deal with them. But you can't even deal with them because they're so stuffed down.
Yeah.
And so those are the two major things that helped me get actual breakthrough
Mm.
that and again, I think everybody should meditate. I think it's one of the best, most healing things out there. But yes, those are the two things.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for those. That is so important what you just said too, what you named about the avoidant avoiding their own feelings. So when you
Mhm.
have attachment wounds, attachment trauma, or even attachment abuse, the idea is that you don't blame your parents. It's not safe in
Mhm.
developmental trauma. You can't be 5 and be like, you know what, guys, I'm out of here. I'm going to go get my own apartment. You
Right.
have to learn and cope with what you're in, right?
Yes.
And so if you blame your caregivers and they're not qualified or capable of taking good care of you, that is dangerous,
Terrifying. Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so we internalize these things. So attachment wounds, criticism, right? If you had a really harsh, critical parent, you are going
Mhm.
to find out later that you're saying the same things to yourself because you've internalized what they
Yes.
said. And the attachment is the same thing. And so you have to reattach to yourself, and there
Mhm.
has to be a secure attachment with yourself, which means for people that struggle with avoidant dismissive, like, or avoidant fearful, listen, I don't know what's going to happen in this relationship, but I know I'm going to be okay no matter what, even if
Mhm.
the person isn't trustworthy, even if they do start to manipulate. I'm going to see red flags and I've got good tools and I'm going to get out of there. The
Yep.
secureness is actually to yourself. And I think that is
Exactly.
so healing. And I really appreciate you for the work that you've done on yourself and now giving
Thank
back to
you.
the community by writing your whole story, which I know takes a lot of courage and guts to do so. And I'm glad that it has been such a beautiful journey for you. And it's taken you to this other side where you can really love yourself and love people and accept love from people, which is, of course, the main goal of
The
attachment
greatest thing.
healing.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I love that. Rita, thank you so much for sharing your time with
Thank
us
you,
today.
Sarah.
Please tell people where they can reach out, where they can find you
Sure.
and find your books, and I'll have it all linked up in the show notes below.
Sure. My website is canyonsandfireworks.com. Super easy. And there's a link to everything on my website. So all my social media handles, my blog, all of that is right there on the website. So it's the easiest way.
Awesome. Beautiful. Thank you again. Have a great
Thank
rest of your
you.
day.
You too. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.